During the Nazi occupation of France in the 1940s, the SS, the paramilitary wing of Hitler's regime, unleashed a system of calculated cruelty designed to crush resistance. Torture wasn't a last resort. It was a method, a strategy, a message. The story of how the SS used torture in France is not just about brutality. It's about control, information, and fear. It reveals how violence became a tool of governance and how ordinary places, schools, hotels, basements, were transformed into sites of terror. In the early summer of 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany in just over 6 weeks. For many, the defeat came as a shock. France had been a victor of the First World War and maintained one of Europe's largest armies. But the German invasion, known as the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, bypassed the fortified Maginot Line and swept rapidly through Belgium and into northern France. Paris fell on June 14th, and by June 22nd, an armistice was signed. France was divided in two, one part under direct German occupation and the other under the so-called Free Zone, administered by the Vichy regime. The German occupation was not simply a military arrangement, it brought with it a machinery of control, surveillance, and repression. From the beginning, the Nazi presence in France was not limited to soldiers. Behind the front lines came the SS, the Schutzstaffel, and the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police. Their task was to identify enemies, maintain order, and ensure compliance with Nazi goals. These institutions would soon develop into the core instruments of state terror. In occupied France, daily life changed quickly. German troops patrolled the streets. Rationing disrupted food supplies. Curfews were imposed. But more than the visible signs of occupation, it was the invisible networks that would shape the course of terror. The SS and Gestapo set up offices in major cities, Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, tasked with gathering intelligence, monitoring dissent, and neutralizing any threat to German authority. At first, the German strategy in France relied on passive control. The Nazis believed that by projecting power and demanding obedience, they could secure the country without massive violence. And for a time, the French population appeared subdued. Many were exhausted by the defeat and wary of risking more suffering. Others believed that cooperation might preserve some degree of autonomy. This hope was embodied in the Vichy government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of the First World War who now argued for accommodation with the Germans. The Vichy regime, though officially separate, often cooperated with Nazi authorities in suppressing dissent and enforcing anti-Semitic laws. However, the calm was misleading. Beneath the surface, resentment grew. Small networks of resistance began to form among former soldiers, students, communists, and ordinary citizens unwilling to accept occupation. These early groups were fragmented and poorly equipped, but they posed a growing problem for the Germans. As resistance activity increased, sabotage of train lines, distribution of anti-Nazi leaflets, intelligence gathering for the British, the SS and Gestapo began to tighten their grip. Surveillance intensified. Lists were drawn up. Suspects were tracked, interrogated, and detained. By late 1941, the Nazi leadership recognized that passive control would no longer suffice. More aggressive methods were authorized. It was during this period that the seeds of systematic torture were planted. The Gestapo's role shifted from mere surveillance to active counterinsurgency. Individuals suspected of resistance involvement were arrested and brought to interrogation centers. At first, these interrogations focused on gathering information, names, safe houses, networks. But as the resistance became bolder, the methods turned harsher. One early indicator of this shift was the fate of communists. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, French communists became prime targets. Dozens were rounded up and subjected to harsh treatment. In Paris, the first executions of hostages began in retaliation for attacks on German soldiers. These public executions were accompanied by increasingly brutal interrogations behind closed doors. By 1942, torture had begun to emerge not as an isolated act, but as a systematic tool. the SS and Gestapo developed standardized techniques to break prisoners. These included physical beatings, forced stress positions, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation. The aim was not just to punish, but to dismantle resistance cells before they could act. The chain of command behind this growing system of violence was complex. At the top was Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who oversaw all security forces within Nazi-controlled territory. Under him were men like Reinhard Heydrich and later Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who directed the Reich Main Security Office. In France, regional commanders such as Helmut Knochen in Paris managed operations on the ground, coordinating with German military authorities and often collaborating with the Vichy police. The facilities where these acts took place were often inconspicuous. In Paris, Gestapo offices operated out of buildings on Avenue Foch and Rue des Saussayes. In Lyon, SS units began establishing their presence, laying the groundwork for what would later become infamous centers of torture. Though these locations appeared normal from the outside, within their walls, terror began to unfold. One of the chilling aspects of the SS approach was its bureaucratic nature. Interrogations were documented, reports were filed. Torture was justified as a necessary means of extracting intelligence. There was no theatrical cruelty, no displays for spectacle. It was cold, organized, and methodical. This efficiency made the system more dangerous. It turned human suffering into routine. Meanwhile, the French population lived in a climate of fear. Neighbors were wary of speaking too freely. A wrong word could lead to arrest. Families of those detained often received no information. Some prisoners returned broken. Others did not return at all. In this environment, silence became a form of self-preservation. And yet, despite the danger, resistance continued to grow. Each act of repression created new resentment. Each arrest brought more people into the underground movement. By mid-1942, the SS recognized that torture alone would not halt resistance, but it could slow it. It could sow confusion. It could break individuals before they became threats. The early occupation years reveal a critical turning point. What began as a military conquest quickly evolved into a system of internal control. The SS and Gestapo did not come to France to fight on the battlefield. They came to fight in basements, interrogation rooms, and holding cells. They came to crush not armies, but ideas, and their weapon was fear. By the beginning of 1942, the balance of power in occupied France had begun to shift. Though the German military still held physical control over much of the country, the growing presence of internal resistance began to challenge that dominance from within. This resistance, fragmented, often improvised, but increasingly determined, was not merely an irritant to the Nazis. It posed a genuine threat to their hold over France, and in response, the SS and Gestapo escalated their tactics with precision and cruelty. The early French resistance had been small and scattered, but by mid-1942 it was becoming a true network. Independent groups, some nationalist, others communist, Gaullist or anarchist, began to coordinate more closely. The British Special Operations Executive, known as the SOE, played a vital role in helping train, equip and connect French fighters. Sabotage operations grew more ambitious. Railway lines were cut. German supply depots were destroyed. Information on troop movements was passed to Allied command in London. The Nazis responded with intensifying violence, but they also recognized the need for intelligence. To dismantle these networks, they needed names, addresses, contacts, and plans. Torture became a central strategy to extract that information. At this point, the SS had started embedding specialized units into major cities across France. These were not conventional military detachments. Their role was internal repression, led by trained officers, many of whom had already worked in occupied Eastern Europe. These units brought with them methods refined in earlier campaigns against partisans and political dissidents. One of the most notorious figures to emerge in France during this period was Klaus Barbie. Assigned to the Gestapo in Lyon in late 1942, Barbie quickly developed a reputation for cruelty. His office became a hub for interrogating captured resistance members. Survivors would later describe his methods: prolonged beatings, electric shocks, mock executions, and physical humiliation. Barbie's objective was not simply to punish, but to dismantle the structure of the resistance by any means necessary. Lyon, a city with an increasingly active resistance movement, became one of the key battlegrounds in this struggle. The city's layout, with narrow streets, hills, and hidden passageways, offered advantages to local fighters. But it also made infiltration by German agents and informants all the more valuable. Arrests often followed betrayals or surveillance, and the SS became expert at exploiting fear to generate information. A single captured courier, under torture, could lead to the collapse of an entire resistance cell. The methods used by the SS and Gestapo were calculated. Interrogations were designed to maximize pain while keeping prisoners alive. Beatings were administered in stages, often focused on joints, ribs, or the soles of the feet to cause lasting damage. Water torture, forcing victims to ingest excessive amounts of water before compressing the abdomen, was common. Electric shocks were applied with rudimentary equipment, often to sensitive parts of the body. Sleep deprivation and exposure to extreme temperatures were also part of the routine. What made these practices particularly chilling was their procedural nature. Interrogators worked from files, questions were prepared, reports were written. It was a bureaucracy of suffering. The goal was not emotional release, but results. Each confession, each name, each address was a tool for further arrests. The system fed itself. At the same time, the SS began training and using French collaborators more aggressively. French nationals who were sympathetic to fascist ideals or simply motivated by power, money, or fear were recruited into auxiliary roles. These included interpreters, interrogators, drivers, and even torturers. Their knowledge of local dialects, neighborhoods, and social networks made them invaluable. In some cases, their participation in torture sessions was especially brutal, driven by personal vendettas or ideological zeal. The collaboration extended to the Vichy police, who often handed over suspects to the Germans. Though technically under a separate administration, many local officers cooperated fully with the SS, sharing intelligence and assisting in arrests. In occupied Paris, Gestapo operations became increasingly effective due to this cooperation. Interrogation centers like the Hotel Lutetia and the Gestapo office at 84 Avenue Foch became feared sites from which many prisoners never returned. By late 1942, the Gestapo had refined a pattern: surveillance, arrest, interrogation, and liquidation. In cases where prisoners could not be broken, or when their usefulness had ended, they were often sent to concentration camps. Others were executed quietly. Notices of execution were rarely issued. Families were left without answers. The intention was not only to eliminate resistance, but to destroy morale, to create a sense of isolation and helplessness. Still, the resistance adapted. As losses mounted, so did urgency and determination. The growing brutality of the SS confirmed for many that there could be no reconciliation or peaceful solution. Recruitment increased. New techniques for evading detection were developed. Ciphers, codenames, safe houses, and radio operations became more sophisticated. The British SOE continued to parachute in agents to train and support resistance groups. Many of these agents, often young women and men from across Europe, were captured by the SS. Their treatment was among the harshest. The SS viewed them not only as spies, but as traitors to the Reich. Torture was used to try to extract information about British operations. In numerous cases, agents were executed after days or weeks of interrogation. One such case was that of Noor Inayat Khan, a wireless operator for the SOE. Captured in Paris in 1943, she was repeatedly tortured by the Gestapo. Despite her fragile appearance, she refused to reveal critical information. She eventually escaped, was recaptured, and later transferred to Germany, where she was executed at Dachau. Her story became one of many that highlighted both the courage of those who resisted and the systematic violence they faced. The SS also implemented collective punishment. If sabotage occurred in a village, Local populations could be rounded up. Hostages were taken, executions followed. This policy, borrowed from practices used in Poland and Yugoslavia, was intended to make resistance too costly to sustain. But it often had the opposite effect. Each act of repression bred more hatred, more resolve, and more recruits. By early 1943, the scale of torture in France had become widespread. Resistance leaders began to develop protocols in case of capture: what to say, what not to say, how long to hold out. Suicide pills were sometimes issued. Silence became a virtue, but the SS adapted as well. They used psychological manipulation, threats against family members, and mock executions to break even the most committed. The Nazi regime never viewed the French resistance as a formal military enemy. Instead, they saw it as a criminal conspiracy, one that required policing, not war. This distinction shaped their approach: brutal, personal, and often hidden. The violence of the SS was not about glory or conquest, it was about domination of the human spirit. And it took place not on battlefields, but in cellars, offices, and back rooms. By the end of 1943, the stakes had risen. The resistance was better organized and more dangerous. The SS, in turn, had become more ruthless, relying heavily on torture to slow down what they could not stop. But even the harshest measures could not halt the spread of resistance. If anything, the cruelty of the SS hardened the resolve of those who dared to fight. Across occupied France, the architecture of terror was not hidden in distant camps or remote prisons. It stood in plain sight. Apartment buildings, hotels, schools, and even private homes were seized and transformed into sites of unspeakable cruelty. These places became the physical infrastructure of the SS torture regime. To the casual observer, they might have seemed ordinary. But to those who lived under occupation, their addresses carried fear like an open wound. Each major city had its own centers of SS and Gestapo activity, but a few stood out for their intensity, their methods, and the scale of brutality carried out within their walls. In these places, torture was not random. It was procedural, documented, and efficient. And it was in these makeshift headquarters that the cruelty of the Nazi apparatus took on a local face. One of the most notorious of these sites was located at 84 Avenue Foch in Paris. This elegant building, situated in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods, became the primary Gestapo headquarters in the capital. The contrast between its grand exterior and the horrors committed inside could not have been more jarring. From the outside, it looked like any other residence. Inside, it was a place where men and women screamed, broke, or sometimes died in silence. Captured resistance members, foreign agents, and civilians suspected of aiding the underground were brought to Avenue Foch for interrogation. Torture was the standard operating procedure. Prisoners were first held in cells or small rooms in the basement, then brought up to offices that had been converted into interrogation chambers. The methods were brutal but systematic. Victims were bound, beaten with rubber truncheons or wooden clubs, burned with cigarettes, and subjected to prolonged electric shocks. Their cries were muffled by thick walls, and the neighborhood was largely silent. Just a few blocks away, the Gestapo also operated out of Rue des Saussets, another building that housed administrative offices and detention cells. Together, these two locations became central nodes in a citywide network of repression. The officers who worked there were not only trained in torture, they were also bureaucrats. They kept records, filed reports, and coordinated arrests with cold efficiency. Each session of pain was followed by paperwork. In Lyon, the epicenter of SS operations was a former school building at Place Bellecour. After arriving in the city, Klaus Barbie quickly established this site as the primary location for interrogations and detentions. The layout of the building lent itself to surveillance and control. Classrooms were repurposed into cells, offices became torture chambers. Barbie himself often oversaw interrogations directly, especially when high-value targets were involved. Survivors described being blindfolded, handcuffed, and forced to stand for hours before interrogation began. Once inside, the routine was grim. Electric torture was commonly used, often with equipment brought from Germany or assembled on site. Victims were strapped to metal frames or chairs and shocked repeatedly, often until they lost consciousness. Others were beaten with fists, boots, or batons. Some were made to witness the torture of others, friends, lovers, or comrades, to break their resolve. In Bordeaux, the Gestapo occupied parts of the Hôtel Majestic, a former luxury hotel that became a hub for German security forces. Like in Paris and Lyon, the hotel's rooms were converted into cells and interrogation spaces. Here too, torture was common, especially as resistance activity increased in the surrounding countryside. The forests and hills around Bordeaux were home to several Maquis groups, rural fighters who carried out sabotage and ambushes against German troops. Captured fighters were often brought to the Hôtel Majestic. Many never left. Other cities followed the same pattern. In Toulouse, the former Saint-Michel prison was commandeered by the Gestapo. In Marseille, several apartment blocks and hotels were used to detain and interrogate suspects. In Lille, Nancy, and Dijon, the SS worked from similar sites. Ordinary buildings made extraordinary through violence. The spread of these torture centers reflected both the scale of the Nazi occupation and the decentralized nature of repression. Each SS region operated semi-independently, adapting techniques and procedures to local conditions, but all followed a shared logic: identify resistance networks, extract information, and neutralize threats. What united these locations was not just their methods, but their effect on the population. In each city, the address of the Gestapo headquarters became common knowledge. People whispered it in fear. Some crossed the street to avoid walking too close. For many, a knock on the door in the early morning was enough to trigger panic. The names of the buildings were rarely spoken aloud. They did not need to be. These headquarters also played a psychological role. The goal was not only to capture and punish enemies, but to intimidate the wider population. The SS understood that torture was most effective when its presence was known but not seen. The mystery of what happened inside these buildings, the muffled sounds, the silence after, amplified the fear. It made people cautious. It made them compliant. In some locations, SS officers developed a personal reputation. Their names spread through the underground, often accompanied by chilling details. In Paris, Helmut Knochen was feared not only for his authority, but for his willingness to sign off on executions. In Dijon, Franz Rinner was known for ordering summary punishments without trial. In Lyon, Klaus Barbie's brutality became so extreme that even some German officers expressed unease, though nothing was done to stop him. The men who staffed these centers were often career police officers, former soldiers, or Nazi Party loyalists. They believed they were fighting a war against chaos and subversion. Some were ideologues, others were opportunists, a few were sadists. But in all cases, their actions were part of a system that encouraged and rewarded violence in the name of order. Prisoners who survived these centers often carried physical and psychological scars for life. Many lost the ability to walk properly due to nerve damage or broken bones. Others suffered permanent trauma, nightmares, memory loss, or deep depression. Some survivors later testified in post-war trials, describing in detail the rooms where they were held, the instruments used, and the faces of those who hurt them. Not all those detained were members of the resistance. Some were relatives, neighbors, or co-workers. In many cases, people were arrested on suspicion alone because their name appeared in a notebook or because someone denounced them under pressure. The fear of being taken, tortured, or killed became a part of daily life in many occupied cities. Despite this, acts of bravery continued. In some instances, resistance fighters attempted to infiltrate or sabotage these centers. In a few rare cases, prisoners escaped and rejoined the underground. These events were exceptions, but they offered a glimmer of defiance in a world dominated by fear. The SS torture headquarters across France were more than places of violence. They were instruments of control. They turned fear into policy and pain into intelligence. They helped the Nazis maintain their grip on a hostile population, not through persuasion, but through terror. By the spring of 1943, the French resistance was no longer a scattered collection of isolated cells. It had become an organized, multifaceted network operating under immense pressure, united by a common purpose: to undermine and ultimately defeat the German occupation. Central to this effort was one man, Jean Moulin. His role in unifying the resistance and his subsequent capture and death at the hands of the SS marked one of the most tragic and pivotal moments of the occupation. Jean Moulin had been a high-ranking French civil servant before the war, known for his integrity and political acumen. After the fall of France, he refused to work with the collaborationist Vichy regime and instead made contact with General Charles de Gaulle in London. In early 1942, de Gaulle appointed Moulin as his representative in occupied France, with a singular mission: to unite the fragmented resistance groups under one coordinated leadership. Operating under the alias Rex, Moulin travelled across occupied zones, building trust among factions that often disagreed on ideology and methods. Some were conservative, others communist, some favoured sabotage, others preferred intelligence gathering. Moulin worked tirelessly to bridge these divides, believing that only a unified movement could effectively challenge Nazi control and gain recognition from the Allies. His efforts culminated in the creation of the Conseil National de la Résistance, or National Council of the Resistance, in May of 1943. For the first time, major resistance movements were brought under one umbrella, allowing for more coordinated actions, better communication, and clearer political goals. Moulin's success was a direct threat to the Gestapo and the SS. They recognized that the resistance was becoming not just a security problem, but a political force. Just weeks after the council was formed, Moulin attended a clandestine meeting in the suburb of Caluire, near Lyon, along with several key resistance leaders. Unbeknownst to them, the meeting had been compromised. The Gestapo, likely acting on intelligence obtained through betrayal or intercepted communication, raided the location. Moulin and others were arrested on the spot. The arrest was orchestrated by Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon, already infamous for his brutal methods. Barbie had long targeted the resistance and saw Moulin's capture as a major victory. He immediately recognized Moulin's importance and took personal charge of his interrogation. What followed was a harrowing chapter in the history of the resistance. Moulin was brought to Gestapo headquarters in Lyon, where he was subjected to relentless torture. Over a period of several days, he was beaten, burned, and electrocuted. His fingernails were torn out. His face was reportedly so disfigured by repeated blows that some of his colleagues later failed to recognize him. Despite the brutality, Moulin refused to talk. He did not reveal names, addresses, or details of the resistance network. He did not betray the council he had worked so hard to build. His silence under torture became a defining act of courage, one that would later turn him into a symbol of national resistance and sacrifice. Barbie, frustrated by Moulin's refusal to cooperate, eventually transferred him to Paris. There, the torture continued under the direction of other SS officers. Still, Moulin remained silent. He died in custody sometime in early July of 1943. His body was never formally identified, but the evidence of his death, both physical and testimonial, was undeniable. Jean Moulin's death was a devastating blow to the resistance. Not only had they lost one of their most capable organizers, but his capture also led to the arrest and torture of several others who had been at the meeting. The SS and Gestapo used these interrogations to disrupt operations and delay resistance activity in key regions. Yet paradoxically, Moulin's martyrdom also galvanized the movement. Word of his bravery spread quickly through underground channels. For many, his silence under torture served as proof that the resistance was not merely a reaction to occupation, but a moral struggle for the future of France. His story became a unifying legend, reminding fighters that their cause was worth enduring the worst that the Nazis could inflict. In London, General de Gaulle publicly honoured Moulin's sacrifice and used it to rally international support. Within occupied France, the resistance responded by increasing its efforts, launching more sabotage missions and spreading underground publications that celebrated Moulin's life. His legacy helped bind together the political and militant arms of the movement, encouraging cooperation among groups that had previously been divided. The Nazi regime, for its part, used the capture of Moulin as propaganda. They hoped to demoralize the resistance and portray themselves as having broken its leadership. But their hopes were misplaced. While Moulin's death disrupted operations in the short term, it ultimately strengthened the resolve of the fighters he had worked so hard to unite. Klaus Barbie, who oversaw Moulin's torture, continued his reign of terror in Lyon. He was responsible for the arrest and torture of countless others, including women and teenagers. He operated with near-total autonomy, and his actions were sanctioned by higher SS authorities. His success in capturing Moulin earned him greater resources and more influence, which he used to intensify the campaign against the resistance. After the war, Barbie fled France, using a rat line operated with the help of sympathetic networks, including elements of the Catholic Church and Western intelligence services. He lived in Bolivia under an assumed name for decades. His past caught up with him only in the 1980s, when he was extradited to France and finally put on trial for crimes against humanity. Among the charges was his role in the torture and death of Jean Moulin. The trial brought back painful memories. Survivors of Barbie's interrogations testified in court. The French public, many of whom had grown up with Moulin's name as a symbol of resistance, watched as the man responsible for his death was forced to face justice. Barbie showed no remorse, but his conviction reaffirmed what many had always known, that Moulin's sacrifice was not forgotten, and that the truth, even delayed, could still be told. Jean Moulin was later interred in the Pantheon in Paris, a resting place reserved for France's national heroes. His induction in 1964, led by President Charles de Gaulle himself, was a solemn moment of remembrance and unity. De Gaulle's speech emphasized that Moulin had not only organized the resistance, but had also embodied its spirit. Moulin's story is not only about personal bravery, it illustrates the moral cost of resistance, the strategic value of leadership, and the brutal efficiency of SS repression. His death showed the world what the Gestapo and SS were willing to do to maintain control, and what individuals were willing to endure to defy them. By the middle of 1943, the Nazi regime in France was increasingly reliant not only on its own security forces, but also on local support. As the resistance expanded, the SS faced a problem that sheer brutality alone could not solve, identifying enemies hidden within the civilian population. The SS had the infrastructure, the authority, and the willingness to use torture. But what they often lacked was information, and it was here that collaboration from within French society became a critical tool. Collaboration in occupied France took many forms. Some of it was political, expressed through formal cooperation with the Vichy regime. Other forms were administrative, logistical, or opportunistic. But one of the most chilling and consequential forms was active participation in the Nazi campaign of repression by informing, identifying, and in some cases directly aiding the SS in acts of torture and terror. Perhaps the most infamous instrument of French collaboration was the milice. Formed in early 1943 under the leadership of Joseph Darnand, the milice was a paramilitary organization tasked with assisting in internal security. Though presented as a force to uphold order, it quickly became a ruthless auxiliary to the SS and Gestapo. Darnand, a decorated veteran of the First World War and an ardent supporter of fascist ideology, pledged personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler and secured support from the highest levels of the Vichy government. The milice attracted men from various backgrounds, ex-soldiers, unemployed youth, ultra-nationalists, and others driven by ideology or the promise of power. What united them was a willingness to use violence in the name of the regime. The milice operated with alarming freedom. They carried out arrests, interrogations, and executions, often without formal charges or oversight. While some members were involved in public security and patrols, special units worked closely with German officers to suppress resistance. They shared intelligence, raided safe houses, and in many cases participated directly in torture sessions. In cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Grenoble, milice members escorted SS officers on raids, assisted in the torture of detainees, and sometimes led their own investigations. Their familiarity with local geography, dialects, and social networks made them especially dangerous. They could spot a false identity, recognize a resistance contact, or identify an unfamiliar face in a neighborhood. The milice also played a role in psychological warfare. Their presence symbolized betrayal, not from foreign invaders, but from fellow citizens. For many in the resistance, being captured by the Germans was terrifying, but being handed over by another Frenchman added a layer of bitterness that could not be erased. In addition to the milice, individual informants, ordinary civilians, played a crucial role in the SS strategy. Motivations varied widely. Some were ideological collaborators who believed in fascism or anti-communism. Others were opportunists seeking reward, favor, or protection. And some were coerced, threatened into cooperation by the Gestapo. The SS developed formal systems to manage and process these informants. Tip-offs were logged, files were kept. Some collaborators received payment, while others were granted immunity or special privileges. In return, they provided names, addresses, schedules, or simply rumors that could lead to arrests. This network of betrayal created a climate of paranoia. Resistance members knew that one overheard conversation, one careless movement, or one untrustworthy neighbor could lead to arrest and torture. Trust became a rare and fragile commodity. Some resistance cells were destroyed by a single informer. Others were forced to dissolve and reassemble under new identities after infiltration. Collaboration was not limited to men. Several women served as informants, secretaries, or agents for the SS. In some cases, romantic or sexual relationships between German officers and French women created access to sensitive information. In others, women were used as bait to lure resistance members into traps. These roles often went undocumented during the war, but post-war investigations revealed their importance. One particularly notorious example of collaboration occurred in Paris with the Carlang, a group of French gangsters who offered their services to the Gestapo. These men, some of whom had criminal records dating back to before the war, operated as enforcers and torturers. In exchange for protection and profit, they helped arrest, interrogate, and in some cases execute suspected resistance fighters. Their headquarters on Rue Lauriston became another house of horrors, where brutal interrogations were carried out with SS approval. The Carlang blurred the line between ideology and crime. Their members did not operate out of loyalty to Hitler or belief in the Nazi cause. They operated for personal gain, thriving in the lawlessness of occupation. Their actions showed that collaboration was not always political. It could also be deeply cynical. The SS welcomed this support. Their manpower in France was limited, and local collaborators provided crucial assistance. They were especially useful in areas where German forces struggled with language, geography, or local customs. With French help, the SS could operate more efficiently and with greater precision. But the price of this collaboration was high. For every arrest made with the help of an informant, families were torn apart, communities were poisoned by suspicion, and after the war, these betrayals left deep wounds that would take generations to confront. The post-war period brought some measure of justice. Joseph Darnand, head of the milice, was captured, tried, and executed by firing squad in 1945. Other collaborators faced similar fates. Some were imprisoned, others executed, and many fled. In the chaotic aftermath of liberation, a period of violent retribution known as the epuration or purge unfolded. Thousands of suspected collaborators were killed, sometimes without trial, as communities tried to reclaim their dignity and exact revenge. Yet not all collaborators were brought to justice. Many managed to blend back into civilian life, their wartime activities unproven or ignored. Some claimed coercion, others insisted on their innocence. In time, the French state would take a more systematic approach to reckoning with this past, but for many survivors of the resistance, the damage had already been done. The role of French collaborators in the SS campaign of torture and repression complicates the narrative of occupation. It reminds us that oppression does not function on ideology alone. It requires participation. The SS could not have maintained their campaign of terror without help. And that help often came from within. This collaboration not only expanded the reach of Nazi violence, but also deepened its impact. It forced the French people to confront a painful truth, that the enemy was not always wearing a foreign uniform. Sometimes it spoke their language, lived on their street and knew their name. As the war dragged on, the resistance refused to be broken. Even as arrests increased and torture intensified, new recruits joined. And in the final year of occupation, the SS responded with even greater fury, lashing out in desperate violence before the Allied advance would finally threaten their grip. By the beginning of 1944, Nazi Germany was no longer in control of the war's direction. Following the Allied landings in North Africa and Italy, pressure on German forces in Western Europe intensified. Still, Hitler's grip on occupied France remained firm, enforced by the SS and its network of collaborators. Yet, as the tide began to turn and the threat of Allied invasion grew more imminent, the SS did not retreat into restraint. Instead, they launched a final campaign of terror, more brutal, more desperate, and more deadly than anything that had come before. This period, stretching from early 1944 to the liberation of France in the summer and fall of that same year, marked a crescendo of SS violence. The Nazi regime, sensing the collapse of its Western Front, sought to inflict as much damage as possible on its enemies, both real and perceived. For the SS in France, this meant intensifying the use of torture, escalating reprisals, and eliminating witnesses who might speak of their crimes. With the resistance growing in strength and confidence, bolstered by Allied promises and the preparation for what would become the D-Day landings, the SS adopted an increasingly scorched earth approach to repression. Torture no longer served only to gather intelligence. It was also used as retribution and psychological warfare. Across occupied cities and towns, SS officers received orders to crush resistance networks by any means necessary. Entire communities suspected of harboring fighters were targeted. When sabotage operations increased, railway lines destroyed, German supply trucks ambushed, the response was immediate and brutal. Mass arrests followed. Detention centers overflowed. One of the most infamous examples of SS violence during this period occurred in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in June of 1944. Although the perpetrators were primarily members of the Waffen-SS rather than the Gestapo, the massacre reflected the broader Nazi mindset in these final months. In retaliation for resistance activity in the region, over 600 villagers, including women and children, were rounded up and killed, burned alive in a church, shot in fields, or executed in barns. The village was then destroyed. The message was clear: no act of defiance would go unpunished. In urban centers, the SS and Gestapo focused on extinguishing organized resistance. Torture sessions, already routine, now became more frantic and sadistic. Many prisoners were interrogated not once, but repeatedly, beaten and broken until their bodies failed. Those suspected of knowing key details about the upcoming Allied operations were subjected to continuous torment. In Lyon, Klaus Barbie escalated his activities in the face of mounting resistance action. Prisoners were subjected to marathon interrogations with little regard for protocol. Medical care was denied. Some victims were beaten to death. Others were deported to camps in Germany without documentation, vanishing without trace. One such case was that of Marc Bloch, a renowned historian and professor who had joined the resistance. Arrested in March of 1944, Bloch was subjected to severe torture over several weeks. He was denied sleep, beaten with clubs, and interrogated relentlessly. Still, he refused to speak. Eventually, he was executed by firing squad in June of that year. His death underscored the SS strategy: eliminate the intellectual and moral leadership of the resistance to break its spirit. In Paris, the SS redoubled their efforts in preparation for the expected Allied invasion. Interrogation centers like 84 Avenue Foch became even more crowded and violent. The Germans knew that if the Allies landed, they would lose control quickly. This urgency fueled a last wave of arrests and torture sessions. Agents of the Special Operations Executive, already high-priority targets, were hunted with ferocity. Captured couriers and radio operators were tortured for codes, frequencies, and contacts. Many were executed shortly after interrogation, their identities buried with them. Female agents, including members of the British and French resistance, faced not only physical torture but sexual violence, a topic long unspoken after the war, but now recognized as a systemic weapon. The goal was not only to extract information, but to humiliate and destroy. These crimes were rarely recorded, but survivor testimonies eventually revealed their frequency and impact. As the SS became more aggressive, their reliance on French collaborators deepened. The milice, desperate to prove its loyalty to the collapsing Vichy regime, participated in mass arrests, torture sessions, and executions. In some regions, they took the lead entirely, with the SS acting in coordination rather than command. This blending of Nazi and French repression created a grey zone where accountability was often deferred or denied. In Toulouse, Bordeaux, and Dijon, local prisons became overcrowded as the SS conducted sweeping raids. Civilians with no proven connection to the resistance were sometimes taken simply as hostages or warnings. Interrogations often lacked any attempt at evidence gathering. They were punitive in nature. Entire families were detained when one member was suspected of resistance ties. The tempo of executions also increased. Unlike the earlier years of occupation, when some semblance of legal process was often maintained for appearance's sake, the final phase of SS rule abandoned even that. Prisoners were taken from cells, led to forest edges or isolated courtyards, and shot. Some were killed inside detention centers, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves or burned to erase evidence. Perhaps most tragic was the fate of those caught in the system just weeks or days before liberation. Many believed they would survive if they could hold on a little longer. But as Allied troops approached, the SS began liquidating their prisons. In Rennes, German forces killed dozens of detainees before fleeing. In Paris, the SS evacuated key prisoners to Germany in overloaded trains, many of which would become known as death convoys. Despite this wave of violence, signs of collapse were everywhere. Resistance groups, now supported by Allied arms and intelligence, began launching full-scale operations. Sabotage efforts disrupted SS communications and troop movements. German morale faltered. Many SS officers, sensing the end, destroyed documents, burned files, and abandoned buildings once used for torture. Others attempted to disappear into the general population or flee abroad. When Paris was liberated in August of 1944, citizens poured into the streets to celebrate. But in the shadows of that celebration were the memories of those who had not lived to see it. The buildings where they had screamed remained standing, some still bearing bloodstains or holes from bullets. In many cases, survivors and relatives returned to find no trace of their loved ones. The liberation of France did not immediately bring closure. The physical end of SS operations was clear, but the trauma they left behind was harder to dismantle. Survivors bore the weight of what they had endured, often in silence. Families searched for answers, and the nation, while celebrating its freedom, also had to begin the long process of reckoning, with collaborators, with complicity, and with the question of justice. This final phase of SS brutality revealed the full depth of their cruelty, especially when threatened with defeat. It was not the desperation of collapse that made them brutal. It was their belief that terror was the only answer to resistance. They tortured not only to protect their regime, but to punish those who dared to oppose it. When the last German troops withdrew and the tricolour flag once again flew over Paris, France emerged from occupation both liberated and wounded. The buildings used for torture stood empty, but they were full of ghosts. Survivors carried stories too painful to speak, while many of the torturers vanished into the fog of post-war Europe. The defeat of Nazi Germany did not immediately end the legacy of SS terror in France. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a long and painful reckoning. The immediate aftermath of liberation in 1944 was marked by euphoria and chaos. France had regained its sovereignty, and the resistance was hailed as heroic. But underneath the national celebration ran a current of anger, betrayal, and grief. Thousands of suspected collaborators were arrested. Some were subjected to swift and often violent reprisals. This period, known as the épuration sauvage, the wild purge, saw summary executions, public humiliations, and acts of revenge carried out with little due process. In the months that followed, the provisional government led by General Charles de Gaulle sought to restore order and legitimacy by launching the épuration légale, the legal purge. Special courts were established to investigate and try those accused of collaborating with the Nazis, including those who had assisted the SS in torture and repression. Over the next several years, tens of thousands of individuals were investigated. Thousands were convicted. Some were imprisoned, others executed, and many were stripped of civil rights. Yet, for all these efforts, the path to justice was uneven. Many high-ranking SS officers had fled before the Allied forces arrived. Some escaped to South America using false identities, aided by networks sympathetic to former Nazis. Others blended into civilian life in post-war Germany or found protection under the new realities of the Cold War, where anti-communism sometimes took precedence over prosecution for war crimes. In France, some of the most infamous SS collaborators were brought to justice. Joseph Darnand, leader of the milice, was arrested, tried, and executed by firing squad in 1945. His trial was public, and the evidence of his collaboration was overwhelming. His name became synonymous with betrayal. But the most symbolic and internationally followed case was that of Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. After the war, Barbie had been recruited by American intelligence, who valued his anti-communist stance and knowledge of Soviet operations. Protected and assisted in escaping Europe, he eventually settled in Bolivia, where he lived under the alias Klaus Altmann. For decades, he avoided justice. The French government made several attempts to extradite Barbie, but it was not until the early 1980s that conditions changed. Under increased international pressure and with a shift in Bolivian politics, Barbie was finally arrested and extradited to France in 1983. His trial, held in Lyon, began in 1987 and drew global attention. Barbie was charged with crimes against humanity, specifically for his role in the torture, deportation, and murder of French Jews and resistance members. Survivors testified in court. Families of the victims spoke of the men and women who had disappeared into Barbie's headquarters, never to return. The proceedings were not only about individual guilt, they became a national confrontation with memory. One of the most powerful moments came when witnesses described the torture chambers, naming the methods and recalling the screams. They spoke of Jean Moulin, of Marc Bloch, of the countless unnamed who suffered under Barbie's command. The trial gave voice to what had long been whispered or repressed. It allowed a nation to listen to those who had endured the darkest hours of its occupation. Barbie showed no remorse. Throughout the trial, he denied responsibility, claiming he had simply followed orders. But the evidence was overwhelming. In July of 1987, he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison 4 years later. Barbie's trial was a turning point in France's public memory of the war. It forced a reckoning not only with Nazi crimes, but with the role of the French state, the police and ordinary citizens who had participated in or turned a blind eye to atrocities. The myth of a united, resisting France gave way to a more complex truth, one of heroism and betrayal, silence and survival. This broader process of historical reflection unfolded over decades. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers began to explore the realities of occupation in more detail. Former torture sites were preserved as memorials. In Lyon, the former Gestapo headquarters became the center for the history of the resistance and deportation. Its exhibitions include testimonies from survivors, original interrogation documents, and artifacts from the period. Education played a key role in shaping how younger generations understood this history. French schools began including detailed lessons on the occupation, the Holocaust, and the resistance. Students visited former torture sites and concentration camp memorials. Survivors gave talks, sometimes for the first time, breaking years of silence to ensure that the past would not be forgotten. But remembrance was not always easy. Many survivors had lived for decades without speaking of their experiences. For some, the trauma was too deep. For others, there was fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, or simply of reliving the pain. The process of testimony was often emotional and exhausting. Yet, for many, it became a form of healing and resistance in its own right. France also took steps to recognize those who had suffered. Medals were awarded, official apologies were made, and names were added to national memorials. The French Republic gradually acknowledged not only the heroism of the resistance, but also the complicity of some elements of the Vichy regime and civilian population. In recent decades, archival research has shed even more light on SS operations in France. Documents once hidden or classified have revealed the extent of coordination between German and French forces, the bureaucratic nature of torture, and the ways in which ordinary institutions, schools, hotels, police stations, were repurposed for cruelty. These findings have deepened the understanding of how totalitarian systems operate through both ideology and compliance. The memory of SS torture in France is now part of the country's historical conscience. Streets named after resistance heroes remind citizens of the price paid for freedom. Museums and documentaries recount the stories of those who suffered and those who resisted. Yet the legacy remains fragile. In an era where historical truth is often contested, the need for accurate remembrance is more important than ever. What the SS did in France was not only a crime against individuals, it was an assault on the very idea of human dignity. Torture was used not only to extract information, but to dominate, to humiliate, and to crush the will to resist. That system depended not just on foreign occupiers, but on those who enabled, assisted, or remained silent. Justice for those crimes did not come quickly. In many cases, it never came at all. But memory has become its own form of reckoning. The voices of survivors, once ignored, now form a chorus that cannot be silenced. Their stories teach us not only about the past, but about the dangers of unchecked power, the cost of silence, and the strength of those who choose to resist. The SS torture regime in France is a chapter of history that resists simplification. It is not only a story of evil, it is a study in how that evil is organized, rationalized, and carried out through ordinary structures and people. And it is a reminder that the defense of human rights, justice, and truth is never finished. As we close this journey through one of the darkest aspects of Nazi occupation, we are left with a question that remains as urgent now as it was then. What do we do with the knowledge of such cruelty? The answer, perhaps, lies in remembering not only what happened, but why it must never happen again.